Welcome all to the third lecture in Cloud Talks program. It's a pleasure to invite and to welcome Philip Oldfield. Philip, welcome to the IIT College of Architecture. You all know that CTBUH is an institution here based at College of Architecture at IIT, and every year in November we in the proximity of the spectacular award ceremonies organized by CTBUH in terms of understand what would be not only the tallest but basically the best tall buildings in the world. So this activity is something what we would really like to see in the future being much more conceptually, structurally linked with the curricula, with the program here at IIT College of Architecture. In order to basically invite somebody who's been in a very particular close contact with Tony Woods, the director of the CTBUH, operational director, actually is Philip Oldfield, who is assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, who actually did his PhD on tall buildings and sustainability, and who is now running the only, as far as we know, program in the world really focused on tall buildings and sustainability. So that's this lecture is of course part of the Cloud series, but it is in a way the kind of possible trigger to see how in the future we're going to address this issue in our curriculum, what kind of different programs and projects we could put in front to address an issue which clearly is now incredibly interesting in the metropolis like New York, like Shanghai, like Mexico City, like many other actually megalopolises in the world. The issue of the tall buildings and the way in which they impact the development of the cities. Tony, would you be so kind to say a couple of more words about what Philip Oldfield was developing to get in relation to CTBUH, and then we will have a lecture, and of course your questions after the lecture should be answered, and we'll have a short debate.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. I'm not going to talk too long. I just want to say it's nice to see some CTBUH members in the audience. I was just talking with Travis from Getch and saying, wow, I didn't know you guys could all come in. He said, well, it's Chinese New Year, so it's like dead in the office because all our projects are in China. So it's nice to see that. I've known Philip for more years than I'd like to mention. Philip's been involved with the council in a number of capacities, perhaps the most important of which is he's headed our tall building research academic and postgraduate working group for the past several years, which last year produced an extremely important document which was entitled The Research Roadmap, or a Roadmap to Necessary Research in Tall Buildings, which outlines about 200 topics that are real gaps in industry knowledge where research is required in an attempt to get the industry organized around certain research projects. As Vedran said, he's also the director of the only, to our knowledge, the only master's course focused on tall buildings specifically anywhere in the world, which is at the University of Nottingham. And so today he's going to present on some of that work and explain some of his ideas about where tall buildings should be headed in the future. So perhaps we could welcome Philip up to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to Chicago, particularly during this nice spot of hospitable weather that you're all dealing with at the moment. But joking aside, it's great to be in the home of the skyscrapers to talk a little bit about its past, its kind of present, and where its future should maybe be. And that's what I'm going to be kind of focusing on. I'm going to talk about three things, really. I'm going to give you a quite personal introduction to tall buildings. And I've kind of called that From London to Tianjin, a bit about my journey exploring the design of tall buildings, and I'm going to try and talk about and answer, is a tall building sustainable? Obviously quite an open question there. The next two sections I'm really going to focus on where I think we've gone wrong, what's wrong with tall buildings, why they leave me cold, often quite personally, and rethinking the tall building, how I think the tall building can be improved to face the challenges that we're up against in the 21st century metropolis. Now, as has been mentioned, I'm a very lucky guy in so much that I run the world's only course and qualification focused on tall building architecture, the MArch in Sustainable Tall Buildings at the University of Nottingham. Now, when you think about the tall building typology, you don't really think about the skylines of Dubai, Shanghai and Nottingham, really. But we're quite lucky we run this really unique course and qualification. Now, the UK isn't known for tall buildings, but slowly over time, you know, our skyline is starting to change. So this is London in 2006. You know, 10, 15 years ago, there were hardly very many tall buildings in London. We had the Gherkin, we had Tower 42 and a couple of others. But over time, we're starting to get more and more tall buildings. Now, not everybody's happy about this. In the UK, there's something called the Skyline campaign. Some of you might have heard of this. This was a campaign run by the Architects Journal in conjunction with, in conjunction with the Observer newspaper. And we're being told that we need to save London's skyline from 230 skyscrapers. That the skyline of London is out of control, that we're creating a Gotham City. Now, it's true that there have been some recent episodes of tall buildings that haven't entirely gone to plan. Many of you will recognise the walkie-talkie, recently christened the walkie-scorchy, after it concentrated light and set fire to a poor bloke's Jaguar on Eastcheap. And we have the wind turbines on top of the strata which don't turn because someone bought a £2 million penthouse and they couldn't get to sleep because all they could hear was Jeanne, Jeanne. So it's understandable that in London some people don't like tall buildings, but we're told more serious things as well. Create streets are Prince Charles' kind of, how can I put this, voice in architecture in London. And they tell us that to house London's growing population, you know, to house a growing population of 1 million people over the next, an extra 1 million people over the next 5 years, we should be building 2- and 3-storey houses. And that multi-storey housing is more risky, it makes people sadder, badder and lonelier. So apparently most of Hong Kong is sad, bad and lonely. But as London tries to pull itself apart over 250 tall buildings, or 230, China's building 50,000. So this is Pudong, 1987 to 2013. Pretty dramatic change over time. I don't know what Craig Streets think to Pudong. I can only say that it's full of mad, bad and sad people. But not only is it Shanghai, but Tianjin. Tianjin's a really interesting city. It's a city of 12 million people, but a city that's going to grow to 20, 25 million people over the next 5 to 10 years. As part of that, they're building a new city centre called the Binhai area, which is 2.5 hours outside of Tianjin with 100 skyscrapers. It's the equivalent of Chicago building a new Chicago in Champaign, with the size of Manhattan. And this may seem fanciful, it may seem like it's just another one of those urban visions, but actually it's happening. And this is being built now, so this is an aerial view of Binhai, and you can see the kind of mini Manhattan being built over there. My last studio I ran at Nottingham, we took our students to Tianjin, and we started to explore what are these tall buildings they're making? What's the urban realm that's being created for these millions of people that are going to be moving to Tianjin over time? And this is what we found. So you've got several lanes of roads and big concrete buildings being built. Is this sustainable? Why is this happening? So that's what I'm going to try and answer. And for me, it comes down to this statement. And I think this statement is probably the most important statement of the 21st century. I think it's bigger than climate change. I think it's bigger than anything else we face. And I think the current generation of architects, my generation, this is what we're going to be challenged against. According to the United Nations, some 193,107 new city dwellers, it's a very specific number, I'm not sure how they worked it out, are added to the world's urban population every day, with 95% of its growth occurring in developing countries. Wow. Where are these people going to live? Where are they going to work? Where are they going to play? 193,000 people every day, 1.4 million people every week, so that's about 6 million people every month. We need to be building cities for 6 million people every month. The tall building has such a great opportunity to house these people, to provide a place where they can work, to provide a place of communities in dense, sustainable, compact areas. And this idea of urbanisation is massively increasing. So in 2008 was the kind of pinpoint when more people lived in urban areas compared to rural areas. And we can see that by 2030, we're looking at 5 billion people living in urban areas. How are we going to house them? As far as I'm concerned, we've got two options. We either build up or we build out. And I think, you know, it's generally well acknowledged now that building out is not sustainable. Tall buildings are often criticised because to build up you need a lot of materials. A lot of concrete, a lot of steel, a lot of embodied carbon. But let's not forget as well that the suburb requires a lot of concrete, a lot of steel, a lot of embodied carbon. To connect the suburban world with the urban world requires great big interchanges. Think of the millions of tons of concrete that have gone into this. I think a lot of you will be familiar with this graph, and if you are not, I would encourage you to get familiar with it, because for me it kind of defines how we should be making sustainable communities in the 21st century. It's by Newman and Kentworthy, and it's not new, it's from 1989. But it's a pretty seminal piece of research where they've looked at urban density and gasoline use in different countries. The denser the country, the lower the gasoline use. That makes sense. If you've got a very dense urban realm, it's quite easy to commute via public transport between 2 or 3 different nodes. For me, this helps define why the tall building can play such a huge role in the sustainable city of the future. But then someone might say back, but you know, do tall buildings really create density? Do tall buildings always create density? Not always. These are some great photos of Denver from 1976 and Houston from 1980. We've got tall buildings, we do not have density. So density has to be within the right model. The 20th century model of the American city with a dense, compact centre of office towers and a suburban spread of residential around is just not sustainable. It's not the way to make sustainable cities anymore. To make sustainable cities, we need to be thinking about mixed use, and we need to be thinking about stacking office and residential, places of work and places of live together. This is a great diagram from Kate Ash's book, An Anatomy of a Skyscraper, where she talks about how in 21 blocks of low-rise building we can actually stack all these functions together into one high-rise. I'm often told a mixed-use building is sustainable because it allows people to live and work in the same building. I think that's rubbish. She wants to live and work in the same building, unless maybe it's minus 21 outside when I can buy into it a little bit more potentially. But if you've got 2 mixed-use buildings, one person could live in one and commute to the next, and vice versa. But I'm also told, you know, actually you don't need tall buildings to create density. What about Paris? Paris is often given as the kind of Achilles heel to the tall building, a 6 to 8 story city, which is one of the highest densities in the world. This is a series of studies from per square mile where they're looking at how the 6.9 billion people in the world, how they could live in one super city if that city was of a density of different existing cities. So London we could fit into a few American states there, but Paris is seen as one of the densest cities in the world. And Paris has no tall buildings, right? If anyone goes to Paris and you're told they have no tall buildings, turn to the east. Was the west, I always forget actually. But Paris has a lot of tall buildings, it's just that they're not within inside the city centre. The tall buildings in Paris allow Paris to operate as a 6 to 8 story city. Many people say tall buildings do not protect heritage, but here in Paris actually they are protecting heritage. They're protecting the characteristic of Paris as a 6 to 8 story city by moving this cluster of tall buildings to outside the city boundaries. So that's a kind of introduction of the ideas of density and sustainability, but still the tall buildings are very decisive kind of, or divisive kind of typologies. People either love them or hate them. And I want to talk a little bit about where I think, in terms of the design, where we've gone wrong with tall buildings. And I think there's been 3 kind of failures, and the first one is the glass box. Some of you might recognise this street. This is Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai. You've got several lanes of motorway with big glass towers on either side. You don't need to have a PhD to know what happens if you build a big glass box in the desert in the Middle East. This is Abu Dhabi just down the road, even more glass. Again, you don't need to have a PhD to know what happens here. You get this. And this is a real picture one of my PhD students took in Saudi Arabia. And people do this. You can bake cookies in your car. So what we've got here are some nice 40, 50-story ovens, essentially. How do we make these comfortable? Well, we crank the air conditioning up. What's the impact of that? Massively increasing CO2 emissions. Energy's nice and cheap in the Middle East, but CO2 emissions are nice and high. And the glass box is not new either. So a lot of you might have seen these images before. Mies van der Rohe's visions of a glass skyscraper from the early 20th century for Friedrich Strauss from the Glass Skyscraper project in Berlin. These are generally considered the world's first visions of a glass skyscraper nearly 100 years ago. I'm not convinced they are the world's first glass skyscraper. Many of you know this building as well. This is Crystal Palace by Joseph Paxton from 1851. It's really the first prefabricated glass building for the Great Exposition in London. And the idea of this building was it was allowing light into the spaces so people could see the exhibitions. But what a lot of people don't know is this is a temporary building. So there was a big competition after it was built. What are we going to do with all the pieces after we've built this building? And there's this great design for the Crystal Palace Tower by a guy, British guy, called Charles Burton. And for me, this is the first vision of a glass skyscraper. 162 years later, we built it. So the Shard, I'm a big fan of the Shard. It's an elegant solution. It's beautifully detailed. But the philosophy behind this building is 162 years old. You know, surely as we move into the 21st century, we should be looking at an evolution of a tall building. We shouldn't be relying on ideas that are a century and a half in the making. And you know what? Glass is great, and view is brilliant. We need to maximise the use of glass in some places to allow light into our buildings and to allow views out. Why build up if you don't have a view? But do we really need glass from here to here? I mean, how many people have eyes in their shins, really? What's more is, when we build these glass skyscrapers, often we then think of ways to cover them. We have our privacy reduced by the glazing. So this great piece of research by the Urban Green Council in New York found that on average 59% of the window area in New York was covered by blinds or shades, and over 75% of the buildings had more than half of their window area covered. This is crazy. What are we playing at? What are we doing? We're building these big glass towers and then we're putting blinds down inside. We pull the blind down, we have to turn the light on. We need to be thinking of new ways to create tall buildings and to be more strategic with our use of glass. The next kind of failure, the next problem, the next area I think we've gone wrong in is what I've kind of thought about as the social housing model. After the Second World War, there was a need to house a lot of people, internationally, particularly in the West, in quite dense urban areas to reduce the slum, to clear the slum, and we thought about building up. Now, what is the impact of that? I mean, today, my studio at the moment, the studio I'm running this year, is in Hong Kong. my students have been exploring the typologies of Hong Kong. These are some of the floor plans you will see in Hong Kong at the moment. The whole driver behind these floor plans is the idea of folding. Why do they fold? To allow light and passive ventilation into every single room. But all these folds are generic. So what you get is this cookie-cutter architecture, which is kind of scattered across the whole of Hong Kong. And the result, which is quite beautifully captured in some ways by Michael Wolff in his Hong Kong photography, is of this. How can the individual portray their individuality in such repetition? You know, the beauty of the kind of suburban houses, we can paint our door red, we can change our garden a little bit. How does that compare to this model? This is not just Hong Kong either. In MVRDV's Vertical Village, they extrapolate this idea across a lot of Asia: Bangkok, Beijing, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Seoul, Shanghai, and others. Demonstrating that there is this repetition of housing, that it's not site-specific, that it's not relating to its location. The last challenge really is a question: where would you want your children to play? On the street or in the corridor? The low-rise suburban house has the gardens, has street, has places where you can sit in your living room, you can look out and you can see your children playing in the street. In the high-rise building, you may be 20 stories above the surroundings. The idea of security isn't there. Which is the most appealing environment to you? The last challenge, I think, is this idea of form follows icon, and I want to apologise for ripping off Louis Sullivan there a little bit. But we're now using the idea of form just to stand out in tall buildings. Every tall building tries to be different to the one next to it for no reason other than just to stand out. Historically, we've used height to stand out for thousands of years. This is Bologna in the 12th century. Bologna was kind of ruled by different families, fighting families. And what they did is they used towers to portray their strength and to portray their influence and their power. So the taller the tower, the more influence the family had. Almost 800 years later, nothing has changed. So early 20th century, the Empire State Building here is using height to portray the strength of the United States to a global audience. Today, though, something has changed. No longer do we need to stand out just by using height. We can stand out by using form. A CCTV tower in Beijing here, designed as this loop of spaces and places, but really just designed to stand out. And it does apparently look a little bit like people sitting on the toilet from different angles, according to Chinese media. What's more is it sustainable? To get dramatic 50-metre cantilevers sticking out from a tall building, you have to use a lot of embodied energy, you have to use a lot of steel. This is a graph of structural steel quantities along the bottom versus number of stories along the vertical axis. As you can see, World Trade Center, Empire State Building, all up there. CCTV's about here. If you want to stand out in that way, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be expensive in terms of energy and carbon as well. And form's a brilliant thing. You know, we've been liberated in terms of the form of tall buildings we can create. Historically, we've always been orthogonal, but with new technologies, new structural materials, any shape is possible. We've got the world's most twisting skyscraper in Panama. We've got the world's most leaning skyscraper in Abu Dhabi, and we've got the world's tallest vertical maze, apparently from Spider-Man, in Dubai. Is this the best we can do with this great opportunity to create innovative and interesting forms of tall buildings? Why does a tall building in China have to look like a dragon? Is that the only relationship we can start to think about? Can we not create more innovative use of form? If we're designing a skyscraper next to a racetrack, let's punch a great big horse's head out the side of it. The idea of being an icon has kind of consumed tall building architects recently. And I think there's much, much more we can do with shape and form. And we've become obsessed. All we seem to be doing is designing trophies on a shelf, each trophy designed to stand out from the rest. Our skylines are becoming these ideas of these trophies, each trying to outdo the other. So what's the solution? Well, I want to turn to a Chicago architect, being that I am in Chicago, and I think this is a great quote as well. This is by Jeannie Gang. There is much more to our current place in architectural history than symbol and iconography. Rather than symbol, the specifics of each environmental condition, culture, lifestyle, and the tools and methods we use to build should be the basis for a new kind of high-rise building that would inherently add value but also transform cities. In a nutshell, what she's saying there is we should look to the place, and we should look to what's special, characteristics, local culture, and see if we can build tall building form and ideas around that. So for the next kind of 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what I think the solution is to some of these problems. Throughout this, I'm going to show two types of building. I'm going to show real buildings, and I'm going to show buildings from my studio that my students have been involved in. But the first thing I think we can do to create more contextual tall buildings is respond to the 3 C's: context, culture, climate, culture, and context. I always get them in the wrong order. And by that I mean we can look for the kind of qualities of a locale and respond to them. Now, a couple of weeks ago, probably about a month ago now, I got an email in my inbox from the Architects Journal, and they said a new tallest building has been proposed for London called the Contextual Tower. Now, because I teach my studios called Climate, Culture, Context, I thought, brilliant. Let's see what this Contextual Tower is. This is a Contextual Tower. Now, what you see here is Leadenhall building by Richard Rogers. This is a Contextual Tower, the tallest building in London. And this sums up the London attitude, or the UK attitude to tall buildings for me. If you want to design the tallest building in London, you have to hide it behind another building. So the whole idea of this building to be contextual is to have exactly the same shape as a building next to it. I assume later they'll have a taller building next to that which will be exactly the same shape. The whole kind of thing will carry on. That's not what I'm talking about. Tall buildings are going to inherently always stand out. The question is, how do we make them also fit in? And it doesn't have to be about this physical realm. Context is much, much more intricate. Context is about the experience of the city, the narrative of the city, the qualities of the city. This, for me, is a more appropriate or successful contextual tower. And this is by one of my students. It's for the south of London on a street called Blackfriars. And this is a 50-year studio project. The student observed that the south of London, the South Bank, is a series of cultural pavilions. You've got theatres, you've got museums, and other cultural points along the South Bank. So what she wanted to do was to imagine the tall buildings as another cultural point along this, to fit in by fitting into the local narrative. Not so much the context, but the narrative. The idea then became this residential tower, an office tower, and a theatre. The theatre became the cultural centre. But rather than put the theatre as a podium, the idea was to lift the theatre up to create an informal street theatre underneath. A point, a cultural point along this narrative, along the South Bank. And what you get is a ground floor of a tall building that inherently is tied into a route, a narrative, a story across the south of London, where street theatre would occur with different things hung from this projecting formal theatre above. We can also respond to the climate. Jeannie Gang's Solstice on the Park, which I read last week, may get built soon now, which I think is fantastic. For me, is a tower that's all about Chicago. The sawtooth facade is all about response to Chicago's climate. It's a cold winter, so we want to get maximum solar gain. But in the summer, we don't want that solar gain because we have a hot summer. So the whole idea of this sawtooth facade is designed around Chicago's sun path, such that in the summer, the angle of the facade restricts the penetration of the solar gain. In the winter, the low-angle solar sun penetrates into the building. And so we get a bit of extra solar gain to heat the spaces up. For me, it's a very climatically responsive building. we can also recognise that when things are warm, when it's hot, we might want to embrace shade a little bit. If it's too hot for a camel, it's too hot for a glass building, really, in my opinion. And we can look at vernacular as well. So this is the city of Shibam in Yemen. It's a 700-year-old city. These are mud skyscrapers, some up to 12 stories high. They're built really, really close together. The idea of building them really, really close together is so they self-shade each other. And what you create are these passageways. These passageways are called seekers. And the idea with the buildings being very, very close together is that the passageways can become quite comfortable because they're shaded. What a great idea. Can we use that in a contemporary tall building? Again, this is a student project that tried to translate this 700-year-old idea into a modern contemporary high-rise, creating these high-rise seekers in the sky. Breaking down the tall building into a series, almost like a bundle of buildings with naturally ventilated pathways in between. There are other vernacular ideas in the Middle East we can look at, rather than relying on the glass box. So the idea of the mashrabiyah. Mashrabiyah is a shading system that's used to create privacy, but also to reduce the amount of unwanted solar gain and glare into a building. So you've got a mashrabiyah historic one here, and we had a couple of students look to see whether this could be translated across an entire building. So here, it's not really the form that stands out, it's the intricacy of the facade. The facade looks the same all the way around, but actually the facade changes according to two things. One, according to which way the facade is facing, so the east and west, the hot sides of the building, is much more dense, this mashrabiyah. And the other idea is that the bedrooms have a much denser mashrabiyah, and the living rooms, that mashrabiyah opens up a little bit more, for a bit more openness and a bit more view. We don't have to only respond to climate in a harsh climate. In a temperate climate, tall buildings can play a role in responding to climate as well. The idea of passive house. So passive house really is this idea where we're trying to maintain as much heat inside a building as possible. Tall buildings are inherently very good at this because they're inherently compact. This is a study I did with some of my students where we looked at different housing typologies and we tried to calculate the surface area to volume ratio. And we found that tall buildings are 7 times more compact than detached houses. Well, why is that important? Well, 7 times more compact means 7 times less heat lost to the outside. So tall buildings can be inherently sustainable in a temperate climate as well. The result of this is this architecture for New York. This was an idea about a vertical street, which you can kind of see in the exploded axle there, with these compact boxes of residential accommodation that's super insulated, hung around. The idea was as well that all the residential spaces were on the south and the office spaces were on the north, and that the overheating in the office spaces, all that extra heat could be captured through mechanical ventilation and heat recovery and translated into the residential areas as well. The other way we can respond to climate is through the inherent advantages building tall provides us with. Now, we all know wind speed increases with height. That has a negative impact. That means we have to build tall buildings, structures with significant lateral stability to withhold the wind. But it also means we can potentially generate on-site renewable energy from sources such as wind turbines. This is a student project from about 5 or 6 years ago now that looks at exactly that, generating energy on-site, acknowledging that actually it's the top of the building where wind speeds are the greatest, and this is a potential, the biggest potential place for energy generation. The students even going so far as to design the robots that would change the wind turbines when they were critiqued about what would happen when they braked. Can the tall building also help with smog? This is quite a powerful image of Beijing. On the left, smoggy, on the right, not smoggy. This was an inspiration to one of my students who looked at whether we can make height a driver for cleansing the air and cleaning the air. This was a tower called the Clean Air Tower, where the student tried to take advantage of the stack effect. The stack effect is basically how air rises. Air is heated by the sun and rises. In this instance, the student designed a south-facing atrium wrapped with office or residential spaces. The idea of this atrium was it was 40, 50, 60 stories, and the sun would heat the air in space, that would draw in smoggy air and pull it up the atrium. Within the atrium were positioned industrial technologies, off-the-peg kind of technologies that are used in industry already, that use things like electrolysis to absorb all the particles from the smog, and thus the idea was these buildings would clean the air of Tianjin. And the architecture went so far as to celebrate all these processes, providing a very kind of high-tech appearance within the atrium. What's more is the construction technology of the building was prefabricated. The idea being there's a time element to this as well. Chinese cities at the moment can be quite smoggy in the north, but as these buildings were built, they could be built higher and higher to clean more and more air, and as the air was clean, they could be dismantled and taken to other cities, basically touring different smoggy cities. Utopian, of course. But these kind of technologies and these kind of ideas take advantage of the unique qualities that tall buildings and height create. The second possibility, I think, for creating more innovative tall buildings is alternative programs. These are two tall buildings in Tokyo that are stacked universities. I know you've got a vertical university there in Chicago as well, but I think it's pretty innovative. One university, two universities, three kind of universities. But we're getting more and more alternative programs beyond this. I'm sure some of you have seen this building before. Does anyone know what the function of this building is? I would point out this has been built and this part's proposed. I'm sure Anthony knows what it is. It's a crematorium. This is a skyscraper for the dead. For very rich dead people, I'd point out. But it's real. I mean, this isn't. This is not a utopia. This is a tall building for dead. For the dead. In dense cities, you know, we're running out of space, so we're starting to have to stack up alternative and different kind of functions vertically. If any of you go to Hong Kong, I would advise the first place to go to is not a building. Go to the cemeteries. Hong Kong's got three types of spaces. It's got flat spaces where you build towers, it's got very steep spaces where you've got greenery, and anywhere in between is a cemetery. And the Catholic cemeteries in particular in Hong Kong are some of the most incredible urban spaces you will ever see. With that in mind, bearing in mind we are building towers for dead people, ideas such as vertical farming shouldn't be too dramatic, shouldn't be too big a jump, really. This is a student proposal that was inspired by the loss of biodiversity in Singapore. On the left, you've got Singapore in 1973, and on the right, you've got Singapore in 2009. A significant loss of greenery as we start to urbanise Singapore, Singapore's population increases. We're in a situation in Singapore now where only 1% of the landmass is agricultural, and only 4% of all food stock is actually made in Singapore. The rest is imported. That's quite dangerous politically for Singapore. So Singapore is looking at the ideas of vertical farming. This was a student project from a couple of years ago that took that to the next level. It looked at these series of aquaponic towers that were designed to have closed-loop systems of growing fish and growing plants together within a tall building. The idea was the buildings were lifted up to provide natural ventilation to the market spaces where all the fish and leafy vegetables were going to be sold underneath. Again, this is an idea inspired by local vernacular. This is a Kelong in Singapore, lifted up fishing villages from the past. The idea was with these towers is, again, they were prototypes of the city. We worked out that 25 of these towers would make Singapore a population of 4 million, self-sufficient in fish. Singapore would never have to buy fish from Malaysia or any other city, any other country ever again. Now, obviously, vertical farming, again, can be seen as quite utopian, but the opportunities really are there to make a significant impact on the future. And again, it is utopian, but it is happening now. On top of car parks in Singapore, they are building stacks of A-frames to grow some of their own vegetables. This is another tower built out of the same kind of ethos, where they're looking again at biodiversity in Singapore. Again, if any of you go to Singapore and you walk around the urban areas, you will very rarely see any birds, because there's no insects, there's no standing water, and so there's very rarely any wildlife or any birds. And this was a tall building proposal to try and bring some of that wildlife back into the city, to try and embrace the idea of biodiversity. Towers linked by sky bridges and greenery, which were also a vertical aviary, a home for some of the birds of Singapore. What about sports? Can we lift sports into the sky? This was a proposal for New York, which was a series of stacked boxes, which had viewing points for different kind of games of tennis, football, and other ideas stacked up in a tall building in New York. Now again, you may think that's quite utopian, but if any of you read Delirious New York by Ron Koolhaas, you will see that as far back as the 1930s, the Downtown Athletic Club had stacked sports spaces. Indoor golf, and quite famously the boxing ring with the oyster bar as well. So again, these ideas may seem utopian, but the future of tall buildings really is embracing these innovative functions at height above the city. The final opportunity, I think, for tall buildings is this idea of placemaking in the sky. Sky gardens and sky courts at height. How we can create communities for our residential occupants within vertical cities. Yangel in Life Between Buildings presents us with this idea of why we shouldn't be building high-rise. He tells us that as we get higher, our impact, our link to the street is diminished. So he says at 5 stories, up to kind of 8 stories, we still have a connection. But beyond that, the connection, the visual connection is lost. And because of that, we shouldn't be building tall buildings. Well, why can't we take that street and repeat it, again, every 8 stories or so, to create that link? And this is what Ken Yang talks about. So Ken Yang talks about we shouldn't just be stacking up repetitive floor plates. Instead, we should see the tall building as a multi-activity tower with different streets and spaces at height above the city. Again, this isn't a new idea. You go back to the 1920s and there were visions of creating gardens in the sky. This is from Popular Science Monthly in 1925, where you've got the multi-level city of offices, schools, and living quarters and playgrounds at height. The first built building to really do this was the Commerce Bank. Now, the Commerce Bank is a bank, so it's not really a residential building, but the Sky Gardens and the Commerce Bank were these breakout spaces for the occupants, meeting spaces, a chance to escape from the world of steel and glass and to sit down in a green space with a view across the city. But really, it's Singapore that's grabbed hold of these ideas and ran with it. Singapore's a very unique country. 85% of people live in social high-rise housing in Singapore. And Singapore's trying to reinvent high-rise living to include sky gardens and spaces of communities at height. This is the Pinnacle at Duxton. It's 7 residential towers linked with sky bridges containing playgrounds and a gym for the elderly, sky gardens and growing spaces for both the public space at the top and the residents only within the middle. At Nottingham, we've just finished the first post-occupancy evaluation of this building by interviewing all the residents there and by exploring how often these spaces are used. And we found that some of them are quite successful, some of them are not so successful. And it tends to be the spaces that have a definitive function, the playground, eating spaces, and the kind of running track, places that have a function like urban planning works to the ground that are the most successful, that people enjoy. And actually it's the random kind of just leftover green spaces that people don't use as much. The experience of viewing the city from at height, this is a walking tour I took with some Singaporean students when I was over there, is quite unique. A big park on top of a 150-metre tall skyscraper. So why is this happening in Singapore? Well, Singapore's pretty progressive, it's pretty radical. Singapore building regulations say, if you build a tall building now, you've got to give back that same land area in greenery at height to your building. This is called the LUSH regulation. The LUSH regulation goes further. It says, if you give back more green than you're taking up, then you can build taller than local planning regulations allow. And any green space you include in your building is non-taxable. It's not included within the gross floor area. And this is why you're now getting all these buildings in Singapore, interlaced by OMA, pretty dramatic high-rise spaces and places. Woes Park, Royal on Pickering. All these spaces and places appearing at height. Spaces for the family to gather together, or spaces to appreciate and to congregate and create communities at height. So in conclusion, the tall building can play a huge role in the 21st century metropolis, but it needs to evolve. We've been relying too much on the models from the past. We have such a great opportunity to develop and to change tall buildings for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Philip. Your questions or comments? Philip, my question. What was the push to change the laws in Singapore in order to achieve some of the buildings that we saw in the last CTBUH conference?
Sure. So Singapore is governed by very tight areas. Singapore wants to grow, current population of 4 million people wants to grow to 5 million people. And it's governed by a unique set of circumstances which mean 85% of people live in social high-rise housing. And so the Singaporean government wants to create communities at height. And that's where this has kind of come from. It's governed by geography, really.
Yeah, when Ole Sharon was showing the project he was working, he said that actually he achieved somehow the way in which it could be really inhabited with a kind of lower middle class. How is that possible? I mean,
well, I've tried to get on site here, and it's not a lower middle class.
It's not.
This is an upper class.
Yeah.
This is not social housing. But this is social housing.
Right.
However, this isn't social housing, and that's a hotel. So I'm cheating a little bit.
Right.
But I think Singapore is being very progressive. It's saying, look, you create these spaces at height, and these spaces at height will not only have a social benefit, they will have an environmental benefit as well. Singapore, very high humidity, large incidence of the urban heat island effect. So what they basically want to do is replenish the kind of grey into the concrete with greenery, and that will deflect a lot of the heat and to cool the environment, reduce the air conditioning bills, reduce CO2 emissions as well.
Any question?
So you're saying what went wrong, right? So what went right?
Okay. I think what went right is that we are starting to embrace tall buildings now. I think this acknowledgement that to build up is. You go back 5 or 6 years when I set up my course at Nottingham, the MR for Sustainable Tall Buildings. A lot of my colleagues said, how can you have a sustainable tall building? there is now a general acceptance that to build up, if you consider the tall building as an object, it's unsustainable. You need more energy to move people around and more energy to build it. If you consider the tall building in the urban habitat, you've got a sustainable model. And so for me, I think that's been the biggest success, the biggest thing that's gone right recently in particular with the vertical rise of cities.
Would a sustainable model ask for higher investment in general?
Possibly. You'd think so. And there lies a lot of challenges there. So if you're a developer developing a residential building, why would you want to put sky gardens in, really? Because you're just trying to, you're just trying to sell apartments. And that's where Singapore's been quite clever, because they've been very, very progressive with these ideas. They've put these regulations, these lush regulations forward, and they're saying to developers, look, you include something for the greater good, and you get something back. We're not going to tax you for these spaces.
So this is the incentives. Hotel again?
This is called the Park Royal at Pickering in Singapore, yes. Oh, where was it? Sorry.
Tell us about the building. This is attached. How sustainable is it?
Not very.
This is
This is, given that it's a hotel, it's quite challenging to critique it in a way, but what you've got is 4 glass blocks, and having been there, I've seen many times with all the blinds pulled down in those glass blocks, exactly like I said early on. So that part of the building is potentially, not sustainable. However, the organisation of those glass blocks is along the axis of east and west. So the Singaporean sun path is very, very high on east and west. So you tend to organise all your buildings facing north and south to minimise the kind of facade area facing the hot sides. That's what this building does do correctly. However, given it's a hotel, I suppose what I was trying to say with this is that you can imagine this being a residential building. You could imagine these being spaces that would be used.
What's the research like looking into building existing buildings, like maybe retrofitting them to be sustainable, because sometimes the skyscrapers exist?
Yeah, I think the IPCC said that something like only 2% of building stock internationally is going to be new. So that means 98% of building stock that's existing, I think they call it the low-hanging fruit of sustainability. It's an obvious contender to improve its buildings. I drive around, or got the L around Chicago, and the amount of buildings where I see projecting slabs and glazing between projecting slabs, and I think on a day like today, those cold bridges, wow, what an opportunity for developing facades that just go straight past all those kind of projecting slabs. And the idea of passive house in particular provides a good opportunity for refurbing tall buildings, super insulating buildings. I know that in Chicago, buildings like the Willis Tower are being looked at for refurbishment to double glaze them or to triple glaze them. And really that's the problem as well. If we build tall buildings across the world and we get it wrong, they're going to be around for 100 years. So we need to get it right the first time. We need to be thinking 100 years down the line. We cannot take a short-term approach to sustainability, because we're going to have an urban population of 6 to 9 billion people in the next 50 or 60 years.
Actually, that's the first thing you've said that I disagree with. 100 years is far too short. We need to be designing these buildings forever, because the reality is humanity has never taken a building over 180 meters down except for 9/11. So we're building now 1,000-meter high buildings with no concept of how we will ever take them down. So these buildings need to be designed forever, not just 100 years.
Why did it do
The one that took you down from the bottom, yeah?
Well, that is actually a remarkable system that they've taken that down from the bottom up. But it wasn't particularly tall, it was only about 25 stories.
It's probably more expensive to take the building down in the first place than to build it, you'd imagine. So, it's,
economical reasons why they only economic reasons
But I think, to answer your point, Anthony, I think you're totally right, and we need to be designing buildings that are potentially deconstructible, or buildings where we can pop off facades quite easily, and as new technology evolves, we can kind of integrate them on there as well, but also designing buildings that are extendable, in top-up density, as I guess we saw with Blue Shield in Chicago. When the market allowed an extra 20 floors were added to the top, that long-termism is particularly valid.
I think one of the issues we should look at, in my opinion, and also what saw the lecture was watching in Nora today, is where is the building located? What is the relationship between buildings in Toronto? So that's something I know that you build a building where how is this building communicating the environment? I think that's something which I think is not studied well enough. That's not to do with economical factors. That's also the reason why it's not talking about the building now only. I think that's a big issue.
Oldfield, thanks a lot for your
Thank you very much.
contribution.